What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. Oftentimes, people will look at a single-stage Pokémon and ponder what it might be like if it had other members in its evolutionary line. What if they evolved into this? Or, wouldn't this pre-evolution be cool? It's only natural, I suppose, but rarely do we ever consider the opposite. What if already connected Pokémon might be better off not being part of an evolutionary line? Now, most of the time, if a Pokémon evolves, it is a pretty good fit, but there are certainly times we can find where additional stages might just be dead weight. So, let's take a look at the top 6 Pokémon that would be better off as a single stage. Number 6. Zoroark. This Pokémon was one of the first ones we witnessed before Generation 5 came out. It even had its own preview movie. But as you might notice, Zoroark isn't the only one shown here. It's also got a pre-evolution, Zorua. And truthfully, I've never quite understood why. To me, Zoroark can easily stand on its own as a one-off Pokémon, and probably should. Zoroark's whole thing is that it's an illusory fox that deceives people with false imagery, and it's a pure dark type, so I think we can assume that this is done with at least some malicious intent. So really, the last thing I need for such a disingenuous character is to have a cute little baby form to try and make me sympathize with it. What's next, a baby Joker? Zoroark was clearly designed to be cool enough as a standalone. Plus, Zorua can't even be found normally in its native region. It's only given out by gift. In the first games, Zorua can only be extracted by using an event Celebi from the previous generation that not many people would have gotten. And in the sequels, you're only given one that is at level 25. That might not sound too bad, but Zorua evolves at level 30, so you're not going to get to spend any meaningful time with this stage before it evolves into the one you wanted anyway, so why does it even exist? If it were a friendship evolution like Lucario, I could understand, but it's a relatively low arbitrary level cap, meaning in the grand scheme of the whole game, you'll barely see it at all, so what's the point? I can only assume that they manufactured a first form to explicitly try and copy Lucario, and didn't quite pull it off. Zorua seems like an afterthought, or in the best case, an obligation someone forced in to chase popularity. Sure, it can do the same illusion tactics as Zoroark, but at half the power. And besides, even if you could get a Zorua, it's not like the AI in the early game is sophisticated enough to struggle or be in awe of your shape-changing strategies, so have fun tricking literal preschoolers, you big shot trainer. Number 5. Lickitung. It could be fairly easy to find Pokémon that could be better off at the end of their lines, since you could just pick off the first ones and think, yeah, I could see that one on its own. What's a bit harder is finding a Pokémon at the front that could deal with ditching the others. I mean, what do we got? Pichu, to try and get out from Pikachu's shadow? But I think one such case could be made for Lickitung. It can never be said that this pink reptile thing doesn't have its own identity. It knows what it's all about. Which makes it all the more strange that they decided to give it an evolution. Would they dare impose on other gimmicks like Smeargle or Mimikyu? No, those Pokémon remain apart. Licky is one of the worst later evolutions ever devised. Its proportions are hugely varied from the first form, to the point that it's almost unrecognizable. It's got some sort of tail coming off of its head, and not the good kind. And the rest of its design choices are less developed than the original. Just look at the stomach. Lickitung has a brilliant full-belly crescent pattern that gets incrementally smaller as it goes. Something that could easily be found in nature. Licky reverts to 3 random bars that start and end at indiscriminate intervals. Perhaps it's meant to be a fan shape, but why? And why not cover the whole stomach like before? And it loses the grips on its hands, not to mention the bib has this as a definite downgrade. It's not like Lickitung was the most realistic Pokémon out there, but compared to this, I can practically reach out and touch it. Even the scrapped beta version looked better, at least it sticks with the larger tongue theme. Besides, this highlights a continuing problem with Pokémon. Originally in Gen 1, not counting legendaries, there were 20 Pokémon not connected to any other. Over the years, that number has dwindled due to added evolutions to only a half dozen. Now bear in mind that this is only the Kanto version of Farfetch'd, since the regional variant evolves as well. And of course, Aerodactyl, Pinsir, and Kangaskhan got Mega Evolutions, while Lapras has a new Gigantamax form. So really the only Pokemon that have truly remained untouched are Tauros and Ditto. What, on a long enough timeline, will every Pokemon have 3 full stages and another few forms to boot? We don't need that. Some Pokemon can and should stay on their own, no matter what anyone says. And I think this Tongue Dinosaur is just such a candidate. And if that doesn't convince you, how about the fact that Licky shouldn't even be possible? Lickitung evolves by learning Rollout, which isn't even all that useful for it, but it could learn that move back in Gens 2 and 3. You could teach Lickitung Rollout by TM and nothing would happen. So what sort of possible abhorrent mutation could have possibly manifested in between generations to result in this atrocity? Answer: nothing. Number 4. Dreadnought. Dreadnought was somewhere in the middle of the Pokemon reveals that they debuted before Sword and Shield came out. And while some simply acknowledged the treacherous turtle and moved on, I was ready to use one. So imagine my surprise when during the early game I found one that had been the victim of a terrible, failed shrinking experiment. Oh wait, that's just a random pre-evolution. It turns out that Dreadnought was more akin to Mudsdale, since it was introduced in promos as well, the difference being that we were told up front that Mudsdale wouldn't be alone, since they eventually revealed Mudbray beforehand. But they gave us the impression that Dreadnought would be a solo creature, and that's probably out of their own shame. First of all, I don't care if this is a fantasy world of magical creatures, there are still some sort of physics to obey, and there is no way that this tragedy could even survive. Its head is at least 50% bigger than its body, so even if it wasn't unbalanced to the point of being unable to stand, it would be physically incapable of retreating into its shell, which I needn't remind you is a major point of a turtle shell. Additionally, Dreadnought was billed as a highly difficult Pokemon to tame, so giving it an unassuming previous stage only lulls in weaker trainers for undue stress they didn't sign up for. It would have been far simpler to keep Dreadnought a solid single stage, like we were led to believe, so that its stubborn status might be maintained, and let it be one of those mid to late game rarer Pokemon that lets you feel truly accomplished for finding and utilizing on your team, because I assure you, nobody will miss its lopsided first form. Number 3. Type Null. This amalgamation of Pokemon parts confused me for a long time. Initially, I thought it was the Alola region's equivalent of Lucario or Zoroark, who we already mentioned, but apparently it was an actual legendary. I still have a hard time believing it, but let's say that it is. It also evolved, which made people even more confused, even though that was consistent with other Alola fare. And when Type Null evolves, it turns into a guy who took his hat off. Seriously, the only difference is the helmet that it has. And some height and weight discrepancies, but nothing worth creating a whole new deck slot for. It's not that Silvally is bad in any way, it just doesn't have enough to distinguish it as a separate Pokemon. I get what they were going for, I really do. It's no accident that Type Null evolves through friendship, and that's an important aspect of this lab-bred chimera. But that bond could have been maintained if it had just been left as a standalone form. Just make it so that once you're best friends with Type Null, it can then use all of the different memory types. And it can still even lose the helmet if you want, or just keep it in its normal type version, or whatever. Or it could even stay as Silvally the whole time. Point is, they are practically identical, even with all of the mismatched parts, so why pretend like it's not the same thing? You can still have all of the significance of forging a close friendship and the memory drives to emulate Arceus all you want, by just keeping Type Null as a solitary stage with different form changes. Maybe then we wouldn't be so bewildered on how to classify this strange anomaly. Number 2. Hitmontop. Branched evolutions in general would be prime candidates for plucking out of their families, since many of them were not originally there to begin with. A Bellossom could certainly stand on its own from the Oddish line, but to me, one of the most suitable for its own spotlight would be Hitmontop. Gen 1 saw the creation of two fighting types with emphases in their own forms of combat, and while not technically related, we could tell that they shared some sort of connection. I think the fact that they shared Hitmon in their names was a subtle clue. But fast forward to Gen 2 and we got our hard evidence. The new baby Pokemon Tyrogue was brought in to evolve into both Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan. This made total sense and meant that instead of choosing just one, you could now breed for both of them. But they didn't stop there. Strangely, the powers that be decided to include another form for Tyrogue to assume, Hitmontop. Now this was interesting since it made Tyrogue the only other Pokemon capable of branching into more than two species besides Eevee, but the methods were ludicrous. Sure, having more attack or defense works for the Gen 1 Hitmons, since you can just cram them full of proteins and max out the stat before evolution. But Hitmontop forces you into exactly even attack and defense, which is incredibly meticulous if not borderline impossible for inexperienced players. But outside of its ridiculously high maintenance requirements, Hitmontop just doesn't fit with the rest of the family. The other three are exaggerated, but are still relatively human-like, well within the realm of believability. Hitmontop's proportions are far more overstated, and everything is somehow less detailed. It doesn't even have hands anymore, just nubs. It shares almost no resemblance to Tyrogue, with the only shared identifying feature being the wristbands, not nearly enough to warrant a part in this evolutionary line. And unlike the clear fighting styles of punching and kicking, this Pokemon relies on spinning on its head. If that's what you want, fine, but don't pretend you're on equal footing. The truth is, as much as I don't care for Hitmontop, I've realized that I would probably be fine with it if it didn't try to horn in on being part of this much cooler family that it clearly has nothing to do with. I mean, it learns all sorts of useful attacks and utility, and it gets more priority moves than any other Pokemon in existence. If they had let it stand on its own, or headstand, I suppose, and called it Gyro Brawl or whatever, it would have not only diversified the minuscule pool of fighting types available in Johto, but would have taken the pressure off, since people wouldn't be constantly comparing it to two previous better options. Number 1. Manaphy. Do I even have to explain this one? Manaphy was one of the mythical Pokemon from Generation 4, and if you're anything like me, at the time, you missed it. Which was especially unfortunate since Manaphy has a special property that no other mythical Pokemon has had before or since. It could breed. If you put Manaphy in the daycare with a Ditto, it would produce an egg, which I suppose makes sense due to the fact that Manaphy itself was obtained in egg form. However, what doesn't make quite as much sense is that the egg, when hatched, does not produce a Manaphy, but rather a Phione. Phione is a smaller, weaker form of Manaphy that also comes before it in the Pokédex. So if you were able to get one, it was 2 mythical Pokemon for the price of 1, and by extension doubly sad when it stayed out of reach. The problem here is that unlike literally every other Pokemon ever, if you breed this egg, it would not be able to evolve into another Manaphy. What? Why? How? The only reason people tolerate regular baby Pokemon is because that they eventually turn into something useful. But you're telling me that I'm stuck with the diet version for the entirety of the game? The only possible consolation we have is that breeding a Phione with Ditto does result in another Phione, and not a third, even weaker version, and so on. But if that's the case, if you can breed infinite blue sea blobs from either one, then why bother having a Manaphy? Just to make kids feel bad that they can only find the inferior version on the GTS? I've listened to explanations before about why they're different due to the science of the beings on which they're based, which, fine, I guess, but I've never heard a satisfactory reason as to why it can't evolve back into a Manaphy. There are other evolutions out there that are way more fast and loose with the rules of the universe. If it's just so that you can't have a full team of nothing but mythicals, then fine, don't let it breed in the first place. Creating a Pokemon that is a flat downgrading across the board, even in terms of cuteness, only to be trapped in that state forever, seems a pretty cruel fate. Since Phione is, and shall always be, at best, a minor inconvenience for filling the Pokédex and nothing more. By all accounts, Manaphy would be far better off on its own, and so would we. I mean, it's already a mythical for Pete's sake, it doesn't need a gimmick. Being an individual Pokémon used to mean something. It was cause for excitement at finding a rare and challenging creature, but now it seems like they're wiping it away. Maybe over the years, if we get enough revisions to available Pokémon, items, and moves, they might actually put some of these changes into effect, and let the notoriety of these standalone Pokémon rise to prominence once again. So, those are the top 6 Pokémon I think would be better off as a single stage. Which Pokémon do you think would benefit from being solo? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And we'll see you around next time!